Here's a mind-blowing fact. The samurai ruled Japan for longer than the entire existence of the United States, the British Empire, and the Roman Empire combined. For over 700 years, these warriors did more than just fight battles. They shaped laws, controlled economics, influenced art, and created a social system so rigid it lasted for centuries. So, what does it actually take to build a warrior class so powerful they become the backbone of an entire civilization? And more importantly, what force could possibly be strong enough to bring them down? We're about to explore the complete story of how a small group of provincial fighters became Japan's ultimate power brokers, and why their downfall was as dramatic as their rise. Though before we dive into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support means we can continue producing these highly researched videos to help you learn something new or pass the time. Please introduce yourself in the comments, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're on to building a global community here. Thank you once more for joining me today, so without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Origins in the shadows of the imperial court. Long before the samurai became legends, Japan's military system looked nothing like what we imagine today. The Nara court, nestled in the ancient capital, relied on conscription. Every able man faced the possibility of service. Provincial governors summoned farmers from their fields, trained them briefly, then sent them to guard distant borders or quell local disputes. This system worked, after a fashion, but it came with problems that would reshape Japanese history. The conscript army struggled with motivation. Farmers made poor soldiers when their hearts remained in their rice paddies. They deserted frequently. Training proved inconsistent across provinces. The cost of maintaining this force drained imperial coffers while delivering mediocre results. By the late 8th century, cracks in the system had become chasms. The court sought solutions. In 792, officials introduced the Condé system. Rather than forcing every man into service, provinces would select and train professional soldiers. These Condé would be skilled warriors, not reluctant farmers. They would patrol borders, maintain order, and respond to threats with competence the old conscripts lacked. The reform seemed promising, yet it planted seeds of profound change. Power began shifting from the center to the periphery. Provincial families of means started maintaining private warriors. The Fujiwara clan, masters of political maneuvering at court, understood this shift better than most. They cultivated relationships with regional strongmen. They offered court positions to those who could deliver military support. The relationship between aristocrat and warrior grew complex, layered with obligation and mutual benefit. In the eastern provinces, far from the perfumed halls of the capital, a different world was taking shape. The Togoku region stretched wild and contested. Indigenous peoples resisted imperial expansion. Bandits roamed freely. Local disputes over land and water rights turned violent without warning. The court's authority felt distant here, almost abstract. What mattered was strength, loyalty, and the ability to protect what you claimed as yours. Families in these frontier zones needed warriors who could fight, not bureaucrats who could write. They recruited men skilled with the bow and comfortable in the saddle. They rewarded competence with land grants and status. These private militias answered to their patrons, not to distant officials in the capital. The monopoly on violence, once held by the state, was slipping away. The provincial warrior emerged from this environment. He trained from youth in mounted archery and sword work. He understood that his position depended on his effectiveness in combat. Unlike the conscript who longed to return home, this warrior had no other trade, no other identity. His family's fortune rose or fell with his martial reputation. These men developed their own codes of conduct, their own sense of honor. Loyalty to one's lord became paramount. Courage in battle earned respect and material rewards. Running from a fight brought shame that could stain a family for generations. The values that would later define Bushido were taking root in these eastern borderlands, though no one had yet given them a formal name. The court watched these developments with mixed feelings. On one hand, provincial warriors proved useful for suppressing rebellions and defending against threats the old conscript army could not handle. On the other hand, the concentration of military power in private hands created potential rivals to imperial authority. The tension between these realities would define Japanese politics for centuries. By the 9th century, the transformation was undeniable. The professional warrior class had arrived. They served the court when summoned, but they owed their primary allegiance to the lords who fed and equipped them. They formed the foundation of a new social order, one built on martial prowess rather than administrative skill or aristocratic lineage. The eastern provinces became the heartland of this emerging warrior culture. Families like the Taira and Minamoto, both descended from imperial princes who had been given surnames and reduced to common status, established themselves as military powers. They commanded networks of warriors bound by complex webs of kinship, obligation, and mutual interest. When these families called, hundreds or thousands of mounted archers answered. The old system hadn't disappeared overnight. Imperial armies still mustered when needed. Provincial governors still held their posts. But the reality on the ground had shifted. Real power increasingly flowed through military networks that operated parallel to, and sometimes in spite of, official channels. The court could issue decrees, but if it wanted those decrees enforced in distant provinces, it needed warriors willing to do the enforcing. This arrangement worked as long as the court maintained its prestige and the warriors respected its authority. But what would happen when a warrior decided the court no longer deserved his respect? What would happen when personal ambition or local grievances outweighed loyalty to distant officials? The answer would come soon enough in the form of a rebellion that would shake the foundations of Heian Japan and announce to the world that the age of the samurai had truly begun. The Masakado Rebellion, the first samurai uprising. Taira no Masakado was born into privilege and complexity. His grandfather, Prince Takamochi, had been demoted from imperial status, given the Taira surname, and sent east to govern. This was standard practice. The imperial family grew too large to support, so younger sons and grandsons received surnames and positions in the provinces. They maintained prestige, but lost their claim to the throne. Masakado inherited this ambiguous status, neither commoner nor prince, warrior and administrator both. He spent time in the capital as a young man, serving in the court of the Fujiwara regent. He learned the ways of power there, the subtle games of favor and obligation that governed Heian politics, but he failed to secure a prestigious post. Disappointed, he returned to his lands in Shimosa province in the Kanto region northeast of modern Tokyo. He settled into the life of a provincial magnate, managing estates and mediating local disputes. Family conflict shattered this quiet existence. The details remain murky, filtered through chronicles written by authors with their own agendas. Some sources suggest Masakado wished to marry his cousin, but his uncle, Taira no Kunika, refused. Others claim his uncles tried to seize lands Masakado inherited from his father. Whatever the cause, in 935 bad blood turned to violence. Minamoto no Tasuku, allied with Masakado's uncles, ambushed him at Nomoto, near the borders of several provinces. The attack came without warning. Masakado, however, proved a formidable warrior. He rallied his men, repelled the ambush, and struck back with fury. He burned the estates of his enemies across southwestern Hitachi province. Kunika perished in the fighting, though whether by Masakado's hand directly or in the general chaos remains unclear. The violence escalated. More relatives joined the conflict, taking sides based on marriage alliances and old grudges. Taira no Yoshikane, Masakado's uncle and vice-governor of Kazusa province, gathered warriors to avenge Kunika. They met Masakado in battle at Kawawa village. Again, Masakado won decisively. More than 60 of Yoshikane's men fell. The survivors scattered into the countryside. Remarkably, Masakado stayed within the law through all this bloodshed. When summoned to the capital to answer charges, he went. He presented his case, demonstrating that he had acted in self-defense against unprovoked attacks. The court, perhaps recognizing that provincial conflicts were best left to provincial solutions, granted amnesty. Masakado returned home, legally vindicated but surrounded by enemies who refused to accept the court's judgment. For 4 years, an uneasy peace held. Then, in 939, everything changed. The exact sequence of events remains debated by historians. What we know is that Masakado became involved in a dispute between his ally Fujiwara no Haruaki and the governor of Hitachi province. When violence erupted, Masakado led an attack on the provincial government headquarters. He captured the governor. He seized control of the province. This crossed a line. Attacking rival warriors was one thing. Attacking official representatives of imperial authority was rebellion. But Masakado didn't stop. In December 939, he conquered Shimotsuke and Kozuke provinces. He controlled 8 provinces in total, nearly a quarter of Japan's territory. In a ceremony whose details vary by source, he claimed the title Shino, often translated as New Emperor. The implications were staggering. For the first time since the establishment of the Heian government, a provincial warrior had openly defied the emperor's authority and declared himself a rival ruler. The court in Kyoto panicked. Natural disasters, omens, and bandit activity already troubled the capital. Now a rebel in the east claimed imperial status. The government declared Masakado an enemy of the state and placed a bounty on his head. The response came swiftly. Several warriors received commissions to destroy Masakado, including his old enemy Taira no Satomori and a former ally Fujiwara no Hidesato. On the 14th day of the second month of 940, they caught Masakado's forces in northwestern Shimosa province. The government army outnumbered Masakado's warriors by more than 10 to 1. The battle was brief and decisive. Masakado fell, struck by an arrow. His rebellion had lasted 59 days. Hidesato and Satomori severed Masakado's head and delivered it to Kyoto. Officials displayed it outside the Eastern Market, a warning to anyone who might harbor similar ambitions. But Masakado's impact extended far beyond his brief reign. He had demonstrated that a warrior with sufficient skill and support could challenge the court itself. He had shown that military power, not aristocratic birth or administrative position, could translate into political control. The chronicles paint Masakado in various lights. Some portray him as a rebel and traitor who threatened the natural order. Others suggest he became a reluctant revolutionary, driven to rebellion by the aggression of his relatives and the corruption of provincial officials. The peasants in his territories reportedly welcomed his rule, seeing him as a liberator from oppressive government. After his execution, legends grew around Masakado's memory. His head supposedly refused to decay, opening its eyes and cursing his enemies. It allegedly flew back east, landing near the future site of Edo, which would become Tokyo. A shrine was built over his grave. Peasants venerated him as a heroic figure who stood against tyranny. Even today, his tomb in Tokyo's Otemachi district receives visitors who honor his memory. The Masakado rebellion marked a turning point. The court had defeated the uprising, but the implications lingered. The government now understood, viscerally, that it needed warrior support to maintain order. Provincial magnates saw that one of their own had nearly succeeded in carving out an independent realm. The relationship between court and warrior class would never be quite the same. The samurai had announced their arrival on the stage of Japanese history, and there would be no going back. The rise of the bushi and the way of the horse and bow. The decades following Masakado's rebellion saw the crystallization of the warrior class into a distinct social group. The bushi, as they called themselves, developed an identity separate from both the aristocracy above and the peasantry below. They were professional fighters, yes, but also landholders, administrators, and the enforcers of social order in the provinces. Their culture, values, and combat methods would define Japanese warfare for centuries. The mounted archer stood at the center of bushi identity. From childhood, the sons of warrior families trained in Kyuba no Michi, the way of the horse and bow. They learned to ride at full gallop across rough terrain. They practiced shooting arrows at targets while moving at speed. They developed the strength to pull longbows that could pierce armor at considerable distance. This combination of horsemanship and archery defined the elite warrior. The equipment reflected this focus. The oyoroi, or great armor, was designed specifically for mounted combat. Made of small iron or leather plates laced together with silk or leather cord, it provided protection while allowing freedom of movement. The cuirass wrapped around the torso, extending into skirts that protected the legs while sitting in a saddle. Large rectangular shoulder guards deflected arrows from above. The armor was as much art as function, decorated with family crests and crafted by specialist artisans. The yumi, the Japanese longbow, stood taller than most men. Asymmetrical in design, with the grip positioned below center, it could be used effectively on horseback. Warriors carried arrows in quivers on their backs, drawing them in fluid motions practiced until they became reflexive. A skilled archer could loose arrow after arrow at full gallop, each shot accurate enough to strike an opponent or his mount. Swords played a secondary role in this period. The tachi, worn edge down from the belt, served as a backup weapon for close combat when archery failed or when fighting dismounted. Sword work received less emphasis in training than mounted archery. The katana, worn edge up through the belt, would not emerge until later periods. The Bushi of the 10th through 12th centuries saw themselves primarily as mounted archers who happened to carry swords. Combat between warriors followed certain conventions. Battles often began with individual challenges. A warrior would ride forward, announce his name and lineage, and challenge an opponent to single combat. These personal duels established reputation and honor. They also served practical purposes, allowing armies to gauge each other's strength and providing opportunities for skilled warriors to distinguish themselves. The emphasis on individual prowess shaped warrior values. Loyalty to one's lord mattered above all else. A warrior who abandoned his lord in battle brought shame on his entire family. Courage in the face of death earned respect and material rewards. Running from combat, even when outnumbered, damaged one's reputation irreparably. These values weren't yet codified into a formal philosophy, but they governed behavior as surely as any written law. Family connections formed the backbone of military organization. A powerful warrior lord commanded networks of vassals bound by kinship, marriage, or oath. These vassals brought their own followers, creating hierarchical structures that could mobilize hundreds or thousands of mounted warriors when needed. The relationship between lord and retainer involved mutual obligation. The lord provided land, protection, and opportunity for glory. The retainer offered military service and unwavering loyalty. Training began early and continued throughout life. Young boys learned to ride before they could read. They practiced with child-sized bows, gradually moving to full-sized weapons as they grew. They listened to tales of famous warriors and studied the tactics that brought victory in past battles. By their teenage years, sons of warrior families were expected to be competent mounted archers, ready to join their fathers in combat. The eastern provinces remained the heartland of warrior culture, but Bushi spread throughout Japan. Every region developed its own military networks centered on powerful families who commanded local respect. These regional strongmen maintained relative independence while acknowledging the court's nominal authority. They collected taxes, administered justice, and defended their territories. The court relied on them increasingly to maintain order and suppress rebellions. Religious beliefs influenced warrior culture significantly. Buddhism taught the impermanence of life and the inevitability of suffering. Warriors took comfort in the idea that death in service to one's lord could lead to better rebirth. Shinto traditions honored ancestors and emphasized ritual purity before battle. Many warriors believed certain shrines or objects possessed spiritual power that could protect them in combat. The relationship between warriors and peasants grew complex. Warriors depended on agricultural production for their livelihood. They took portions of peasant harvests as payment for protection. In return, they maintained order, settled disputes, and defended villages from bandits. The arrangement worked when warriors fulfilled their obligations, but abuse of power was common. Warriors could be both protectors and oppressors, depending on individual character and circumstances. By the 12th century, the Bushi had become indispensable to Japanese society. The court in Kyoto could no longer maintain order without them. Provincial administration depended on their cooperation. They had developed a sophisticated military culture with its own values, equipment, and traditions. They were no longer simply armed men in service to others. They were a class unto themselves, conscious of their identity and growing confident in their power. The stage was set for these warriors to move from the periphery to the center of Japanese politics, and when that moment came, it would arrive with shocking violence. The Genpei War. The samurai seized the nation. By 1180, tension between the Taira and Minamoto clans had reached breaking point. Both descended from imperial princes granted surnames and sent to the provinces generations earlier. Both had risen to prominence as military powers. But where the Minamoto maintained strong bases in the eastern provinces, the Taira had cultivated influence at court. Taira no Kiyomori, through careful political maneuvering and strategic marriages, had made his family the dominant force in Kyoto. Kiyomori's power seemed absolute. He held the highest position in government. His daughter had married the emperor. When their son Antoku, barely 2 years old, took the throne in 1180, the Taira appeared unstoppable. But this concentration of power bred resentment. The retired emperor Go Shirakawa chafed under Taira dominance. Provincial warriors, particularly the Minamoto and their allies, saw opportunities being monopolized by one clan. The kingdom stood on the edge of civil war. Prince Mochihito, Go Shirakawa's son, felt denied his rightful place on the throne. With Minamoto no Yorimasa's support, he issued a call to arms in May 1180. The proclamation traveled to Buddhist monasteries and warrior families throughout the provinces, urging resistance against Taira tyranny. Kiyomori ordered Mochihito's arrest. The prince fled to Midera Temple, seeking sanctuary. Taira forces pursued him. The Battle of Uji opened the war. Yorimasa and Mochihito's defenders held a bridge over the Uji River just outside Kyoto. The Taira army vastly outnumbered them. After fierce fighting, the defenders fell. Yorimasa committed ritual suicide. Mochihito perished in the retreat. The rebellion seemed crushed before it truly began. But the call to arms had already spread too far to recall. In the eastern provinces, Minamoto no Yoritomo received word of the uprising. He had spent 20 years in exile after his family's defeat in an earlier conflict, watched carefully by Taira loyalists. Now he saw his chance. He rallied warriors to his cause, using his Minamoto lineage to legitimize the rebellion. Families throughout the Kanto region declared for him. By late 1180, Yoritomo commanded a substantial force. The war spread rapidly. Local disputes merged with the larger conflict. Old rivalries found expression in the choice of sides. Warriors switched allegiances based on immediate advantage or long-standing obligations. The court's authority fragmented as different factions supported different claimants to power. What began as a succession dispute evolved into a nationwide civil war. In 1183, Minamoto no Yoshinaka, Yoritomo's cousin, scored a crucial victory at the Battle of Kurakara. Leading Taira forces into a mountain pass, he stampeded cattle toward them at night, creating chaos. The Taira army broke and fled. Yoshinaka pursued them to the capital. Taira no Kiyomori had died the previous year, and his successors decided to evacuate Kyoto rather than face siege. They took the child emperor Antoku and the imperial regalia with them, retreating west. Yoshinaka entered Kyoto in triumph, but his success proved short-lived. He alienated the court with his rough provincial manners. He quarreled with retired Emperor Go Shirakawa over resources and authority. Yoritomo, worried about his cousin's growing independence, ordered another cousin, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, to bring Yoshinaka to heel. The two Minamoto forces met in battle near Kyoto in early 1184. Yoshinaka perished in the fighting, ending his brief moment of glory. Yoshitsune now led the pursuit of the Taira. In February 1184, he attacked their position at Ichi-no-Tani, a fortified camp backed against steep cliffs near present-day Kobe. Rather than assault the fortified entrance, Yoshitsune led a small force down the supposedly impassable cliffs in a surprise attack. The Taira fled to their ships, escaping again but losing many warriors and supplies. The war entered its final phase. The Taira established a base on Yashima, an island fortress in the inland sea. Yoshitsune, demonstrating the boldness that made him legendary, launched a surprise attack across the water in March 1185. Again, the Taira fled to their ships. They knew the next battle would be decisive. Both sides prepared for a final confrontation. The Battle of Dan-no-Ura took place on April 25, 1185, in the Shimonoseki Strait between the islands of Honshu and Kyushu. The Minamoto fleet, numbering about 840 ships, engaged roughly 500 Taira vessels. The morning tide favored the Taira, experienced sailors familiar with these treacherous waters. Their archers inflicted heavy casualties on the crowded Minamoto ships. Then the tide shifted, literally and figuratively. The ocean current reversed, carrying Minamoto ships toward the Taira. A Taira warrior named Taguchi Shigeyoshi defected, revealing which ship carried the child emperor. Minamoto warriors focused their assault on that vessel. The Taira defense crumbled. Taira commanders began committing suicide rather than face capture. Taira no Tomomori, the clan's military leader, threw himself into the sea after weighing himself down with armor. The emperor's grandmother, widow of Taira no Kiyomori, took young Antoku in her arms and jumped into the waves. The child emperor drowned, taking with him the sacred sword of the imperial regalia. Many other Taira nobles followed them into the water. The clan that had dominated Japan for decades was destroyed in a single afternoon. Yoshitsune's victory was complete, but it would bring him little happiness. Yoritomo, suspicious of his brother's growing fame and perhaps worried about his ambitions, turned against him. Yoshitsune fled, spending years as a fugitive before meeting his end in northern Japan. The details of his death remain disputed, but the tragic arc of his life became the stuff of legend, celebrated in poems, plays, and stories for centuries. Yoritomo, meanwhile, consolidated power from his base in Kamakura, far from the intrigues of Kyoto. He negotiated with the court for unprecedented authority. In 1192, he received the title of shogun, the supreme military commander. Though the emperor remained on his throne in Kyoto, real power now resided with Yoritomo and his warrior government in the east. The age of aristocratic rule had ended. The age of the samurai had begun in earnest. The Kamakura shogunate, the first warrior government. Minamoto no Yoritomo faced a delicate task after his victory. He commanded the most powerful military force in Japan, yet he understood that ruling through naked force alone would create endless resistance. He needed to construct a government that preserved the forms of traditional authority while fundamentally shifting where real power lay. The system he built would define Japanese politics for centuries. Yoritomo established his headquarters in Kamakura, a coastal town far from Kyoto. This choice was deliberate. Kamakura lay at the heart of the eastern provinces where Minamoto's strength was greatest. Mountains surrounded it on three sides, providing natural defenses. The location allowed Yoritomo to maintain distance from the intrigues of the imperial court while remaining close to his power base. From Kamakura, he could monitor his vassals and respond quickly to threats. The institutional structure Yoritomo created combined innovation and tradition. He established the Samurai Dokoro, the board of retainers, to oversee his warrior followers. This office recorded obligations, mediated disputes between vassals, and enforced discipline. Next came the Mandokoro, the administrative board, which handled finances and general administration. Finally, the Manchujo, the board of inquiry, dealt with legal matters and judicial appeals. These three organs formed the core of shogunal government. Yoritomo's genius lay in how he extended his control throughout Japan without overtly challenging imperial authority. He petitioned the court for permission to appoint officials in the provinces. The court, weakened and dependent on warrior support, granted this request. Yoritomo created two new positions, the shugo, or military governors, and the jito, or land stewards. Together, these offices gave him unprecedented reach into provincial affairs. The shugo served as Yoritomo's representatives in each province. They commanded military forces, pursued criminals, and maintained order. Crucially, they answered to Kamakura, not to the provincial governors appointed by the court. This created a parallel administrative structure that increasingly overshadowed the old system. Warriors who received shugo appointments gained prestige and authority, binding them more tightly to the shogunate. The jito managed individual estates, collecting revenues and overseeing agricultural production. Yoritomo appointed his vassals to these positions, giving them secure income from land they administered. The jito system allowed the shogun to reward loyal followers while establishing presence throughout the country. It also created networks of obligation that extended from Yoritomo down through his direct vassals to their own followers, forming a feudal hierarchy based on land tenure and military service. This structure differed fundamentally from the old court system. Heian aristocrats derived power from hereditary position and proximity to the emperor. They governed through elaborate bureaucracies and cultural prestige. Yoritomo's system ran on personal relationships, military prowess, and land grants. A warrior's status depended on service to his lord and skill in combat, not birth or administrative credentials. The shift represented a complete reordering of Japanese society. The Goseibai Shikimoku, promulgated in 1232 under Yoritomo's successors, codified these relationships into law. This legal code addressed practical matters: inheritance rules, duties of vassals, procedures for resolving disputes. Written in simple language rather than the classical Chinese used by court documents, it reflected warrior values and concerns. The code emphasized loyalty, military obligation, and the importance of clear lines of authority. Relations between Kamakura and Kyoto remained complex. The emperor retained theoretical supremacy. Religious ceremonies, cultural patronage, and the mystique of imperial descent belonged to the court. But real power over military matters, taxation, and law enforcement resided with the shogun. This division of authority, with the emperor as symbolic sovereign and the shogun as effective ruler, would persist in various forms until the 19th century. Yoritomo died in 1199 under circumstances that remain unclear. Some sources suggest he fell from his horse. Others hint at assassination. Whatever the cause, his death created a succession crisis. His sons proved weak rulers, unable to command the loyalty their father had earned. Real power shifted to the Hojo family, Yoritomo's wife's relatives, who ruled as regents to puppet shoguns. This arrangement seemed bizarre even by Japanese standards, a regent controlling a military dictator who in turn controlled an emperor. But it worked remarkably well for over a century. The Hojo regents, particularly Hojo Tokimasa and his son Yoshitoki, proved capable administrators. They strengthened the shogunate's institutions, codified its laws, and successfully defended Japan against external threats. They also ruthlessly eliminated potential rivals, including members of the Minamoto family itself. By the early 13th century, the Minamoto clan had been largely destroyed, victims of the very system Yoritomo had created. The Kamakura government's success depended on maintaining warrior loyalty through land grants and military opportunities. As long as the system delivered rewards to its supporters, it remained stable. Warriors accepted Hojo leadership because it provided order, prosperity, and respect for martial values. The shogunate mediated disputes fairly, punished oath-breakers, and upheld the principle that service should be rewarded. These practices earned loyalty that aristocratic pretension never could. Buddhism flourished under warrior patronage. New sects emphasizing personal devotion and simplified practice appealed to warriors more than the elaborate ceremonies favored by aristocrats. Zen Buddhism, with its emphasis on discipline and direct experience, found particular favor among the samurai class. The relationship between warrior and monk grew close, with many retired warriors taking Buddhist vows and monasteries receiving generous donations from warrior patrons. The Kamakura period established patterns that would endure. Political power flowed from military strength, not aristocratic birth. Personal loyalty mattered more than institutional office. Land grants formed the basis of the economic system. These principles, first implemented by Yoritomo and refined by his successors, created a distinctly Japanese form of feudalism. The warriors had gone from provincial enforcers to the ruling class of Japan, and they would not relinquish that position easily. The shogunate would face its greatest test soon enough when foreign invaders arrived on Japan's shores with ambitions to conquer the entire island nation. The Mongol invasions. A divine wind saves the samurai. In 1274, Japan faced a threat unlike any in its history. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, had unified China and set his sights on the island kingdom across the sea. His emissaries had arrived years earlier demanding submission. The Hojo regents, ruling through the Kamakura shogunate, had refused. Now the most formidable military force in the world prepared to enforce the Khan's will. The Mongol army that assembled in Korea represented a terrifying blend of Chinese, Korean, and Mongol warriors. They brought technologies and tactics Japanese warriors had never encountered. Explosive bombs that scattered shrapnel could break formations and terrify horses. Massed infantry fighting in disciplined units moved as single entities rather than collections of individuals. Crossbows could be fired more rapidly than traditional bows and required less training to use effectively. The invasion fleet sailed in November 1274. Storm delayed but undeterred, roughly 900 ships carrying perhaps 30,000 warriors approached the islands of Tsushima and Iki first. The small garrisons on these islands fought bravely but were quickly overwhelmed. The Mongol forces used tactics that seemed strange and dishonorable to Japanese defenders. They fought in coordinated groups rather than individual challenges. They employed stratagem and deception freely. They showed no respect for the conventions of warfare that governed samurai combat. By late November, the Mongol fleet reached Hakata Bay in northern Kyushu. Warriors from across Kyushu had gathered to defend the coast. The Hojo regent Tokimune had ordered mobilization months earlier, and thousands of samurai stood ready. What followed was a brutal education in the difference between Japanese and continental warfare. The samurai expected warfare to follow traditional patterns. A warrior would ride forward, announce his name and lineage, challenge an opponent to single combat. The Mongol response was pragmatic and deadly. Groups of soldiers surrounded individual samurai, shot them with crossbows, or used explosive devices to break their charges. The emphasis on personal glory that defined Japanese warfare proved a liability against enemies who cared only for collective victory. Despite the shock of these new tactics, Japanese warriors held. Fighting raged throughout the day as samurai adapted to the reality they faced. They learned to fight in groups. They targeted Mongol commanders. They used knowledge of local terrain to offset the invaders' advantages. By nightfall, neither side had achieved decisive victory. The Mongols retreated to their ships, planning to renew the assault at dawn. That night, a storm struck Hakata Bay. Fierce winds and rough seas battered the Mongol fleet. Ships designed for rivers and coastal waters struggled in open ocean conditions. Many vessels were damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of warriors drowned. By morning, the invasion force had withdrawn, sailing back to Korea with heavy losses. Japan had survived, but more through fortune than martial prowess. The Hojo regents understood that the Mongols would return. They immediately ordered defensive preparations. A massive stone wall was constructed along the coast of Hakata Bay, designed to prevent enemy landings. Warriors throughout Kyushu received orders to maintain readiness. Buddhist temples held prayers for divine protection. The whole nation prepared for the next assault. 7 years passed. The Mongol court dispatched more emissaries demanding submission. The Hojo response was to execute them. Kublai Khan, not a man to forgive such insults, assembled an even larger invasion force. This time, 2 fleets would converge on Japan. One would sail from Korea as before. Another, even larger, would depart from southern China. Together, they would carry more than 140,000 warriors, the largest amphibious invasion attempted anywhere in the world up to that time. The first fleet arrived at Hakata Bay in June 1281. They found the defensive wall and a prepared enemy. For weeks, they probed the defenses, launched raids, and fought skirmishes with the defenders. The wall proved its worth, preventing large-scale landings. Small boats carrying samurai raiders harassed the Mongol fleet at night, boarding ships and causing chaos. The invasion bogged down. In August, the second fleet arrived from China. Now, the Mongols had overwhelming numerical superiority. They prepared for a massive assault that would surely overwhelm the defenders. The samurai understood they faced desperate circumstances. They fought with the fury of men protecting their homes, but numbers and technology seemed likely to decide the outcome. Then, on August 15, 1281, nature intervened again. A typhoon, larger and more destructive than the storm 7 years earlier, struck the Mongol fleet. For 2 days, hurricane-force winds and enormous waves battered the ships. Vessels crashed into each other. Anchors dragged and ships ran aground. Soldiers tried to swim to shore and drowned in the rough seas. The destruction was catastrophic. When the storm passed, the Mongol invasion force had been shattered. Perhaps half their ships were destroyed. Tens of thousands of warriors had perished. The survivors fled back to the continent, abandoning any hope of conquest. Kublai Khan reportedly considered a third invasion but never launched it. Age, other campaigns, and the memory of 2 failed attempts stayed his hand. The Japanese called the typhoons kamikaze, divine winds. The timing seemed too perfect to be mere chance. Surely the gods had intervened to protect their favored islands. This interpretation strengthened the belief that Japan enjoyed special divine protection. Shinto shrines dedicated to the kami, the spirits, received generous donations from grateful warriors. The sense of being a sacred nation defended by supernatural forces would influence Japanese thought for centuries. Yet the invasions left troubling legacies. The shogunate had successfully organized the defense, but at enormous cost. Warriors who fought expected rewards, typically in the form of land grants, but there were no conquered territories to distribute, no spoils to divide. Many warriors received little or nothing for their service. Resentment grew, particularly among those who had spent years manning defenses or sustaining financial burdens from the constant state of readiness. The economic strain weakened the Kamakura shogunate. Maintaining defenses, building walls, and keeping warriors mobilized drained resources. The government borrowed heavily and struggled to repay debts. Warriors who felt inadequately rewarded began questioning the shogunate's legitimacy. The invasions had saved Japan from foreign conquest, but planted seeds of internal discord that would eventually tear the warrior government apart. The military lessons proved equally significant. Japanese warriors had faced an enemy that fought in ways completely foreign to their traditions. They had adapted, learned, and ultimately prevailed with the weather's help. But the experience revealed vulnerabilities in their approach to warfare. The emphasis on individual combat, while honorable, could be exploited by enemies who fought collectively. The focus on mounted archery left them unprepared for massed infantry tactics. These realizations would gradually reshape samurai warfare, though tradition resisted change at every step. The Mongol invasions remained embedded in Japanese consciousness long after the threat passed. They represented the only serious foreign invasion attempt until the 19th century. The kamikaze became a powerful symbol, invoked whenever Japan faced external danger. The warriors who defended Hakata Bay entered legend, their courage and sacrifice celebrated in songs and stories. The invasions demonstrated both the strength and fragility of the samurai order, its capacity for heroism, and its dependence on forces beyond any warrior's control. The Meiji Restoration, imperial ambition, and Ashikaga treachery. By the early 14th century, the Kamakura shogunate had grown weak. The Mongol invasions had strained its finances without providing the spoils of victory that might have offset the costs. Warriors throughout Japan nursed grievances over inadequate rewards and heavy debts. The Hojo regents, who had ruled effectively for generations, now seemed distant and unresponsive. Into this climate of discontent stepped an emperor who dreamed of restoring direct imperial rule. Emperor Go-Daigo ascended the throne in 1318. Unlike many emperors before him, who had been content with ceremonial roles, Go-Daigo harbored genuine political ambitions. He studied the classical texts that described emperors as active rulers rather than symbolic figures. He believed the current system, with warriors holding real power while the court provided mere legitimacy, represented a perversion of the natural order. He began plotting to overthrow the shogunate. The initial conspiracy failed spectacularly. In 1324, the plot was discovered before Go-Daigo could act. The Hojo regents, however, handled the situation delicately. They chose not to depose Go-Daigo, perhaps fearing that such an act would alienate other aristocrats. Instead, they executed some conspirators and forced Go-Daigo to accept increased supervision. The emperor learned caution but did not abandon his ambitions. For several years, Go-Daigo bided his time, building support more carefully. He cultivated relationships with warrior families who felt alienated from the shogunate. He promised rewards and positions to those who would support imperial restoration. He reached out to powerful temples and monasteries, seeking their military forces. By 1331, he was ready to try again. This second conspiracy also failed in its initial stages. The shogunate learned of Go-Daigo's plans and moved to arrest him. The emperor fled Kyoto, seeking refuge first at Nara's temples, then eventually at Mount Kasagi. Shogunal forces pursued him. After a brief siege, Go-Daigo was captured and exiled to the Oki Islands, a remote location in the Sea of Japan. The Hojo installed a different emperor in Kyoto. The rebellion seemed crushed, but Go-Daigo's call to arms had spread too widely to be recalled. Warriors throughout Japan, motivated by various grievances against the shogunate, rose in rebellion. The most significant of these, Kusunoki Masashige, a warrior of modest origins from Kawachi province. Masashige proved a brilliant guerrilla commander, using unconventional tactics to defeat larger shogunate forces. His success inspired others and demonstrated the shogunate's vulnerability. In 1333, Go-Daigo escaped from exile. The details remain somewhat unclear, but he managed to reach the mainland and rallied supporters. The shogunate dispatched armies to suppress the rebellion, including a large force commanded by Ashikaga Takauji, a powerful warrior from a prestigious family. But Takauji had been cultivating his own ambitions. Recognizing the shogunate's weakness and the emperor's potential as a tool for his own advancement, he switched sides. Takauji's defection proved decisive. His forces marched on Kyoto, defeated the shogunate's defenders, and drove the Hojo representatives from the capital. Simultaneously, another general named Nita Yoshisada, also of the Minamoto line, attacked Kamakura itself. The shogunate's headquarters fell after fierce fighting. The Hojo regents and their supporters committed mass suicide. The Kamakura shogunate, which had ruled Japan for nearly 150 years, collapsed in a matter of months. Go-Daigo returned to Kyoto in triumph and immediately began what became known as the Meiji Restoration. He sought to return Japan to direct imperial rule, abolishing the institutions of warrior government. He dismissed the positions of shogun, shugo, and jito. He established new administrative offices staffed by aristocrats rather than warriors. He attempted to reverse more than a century of political evolution in a single stroke. The restoration faced immediate problems. Go-Daigo's government proved incompetent at administration. Aristocrats accustomed to ceremonial roles struggled with practical governance. Decisions were delayed or made arbitrarily. The emperor rewarded his favorites lavishly while neglecting those who had actually fought for him. Warriors who had risked everything to support the restoration found themselves marginalized in favor of courtiers who had contributed nothing to the victory. Ashikaga Takauji watched these developments with growing frustration. He had expected significant rewards for his crucial role in Go-Daigo's victory. Instead, he received what he considered inadequate recognition. More importantly, he saw capable warrior administrators being replaced by incompetent aristocrats. The system Go-Daigo created seemed designed to fail, and Takauji had no intention of going down with it. Tensions came to a head in 1335. A relative of the Hojo clan led a brief rebellion, which Takauji suppressed. But rather than returning to Kyoto as ordered, Takauji remained in Kamakura, establishing his own base of power. Go-Daigo, recognizing the threat, sent armies against him. Takauji defeated them and began his own march on the capital. Civil war had begun again, barely 2 years after the Meiji Restoration started. In 1336, Takauji captured Kyoto. Go-Daigo fled to the mountains south of the capital, taking the imperial regalia with him. Takauji installed a different emperor from a rival branch of the imperial family, one more amenable to warrior government. This created a constitutional crisis. 2 emperors, each claiming legitimacy, each controlling part of the regalia that symbolized imperial authority. Go-Daigo established his court at Yoshino in the mountains of Yamato province. Takauji's emperor remained in Kyoto. Thus began the Nanboku-cho period, the era of the northern and southern courts. For the next 60 years, Japan would have 2 competing imperial courts, each claiming to be the legitimate government. Warriors aligned with one side or the other based on advantage, loyalty, or regional power dynamics. The ideological conflict ran deep. Go-Daigo and his successors at the southern court represented the principle of imperial supremacy, the idea that the emperor should actively rule rather than merely reign. The northern court in Kyoto, backed by Ashikaga power, accepted the division of authority between symbolic emperor and effective military ruler. The question being fought out was fundamental: who should actually govern Japan? Kusunoki Masashige, the guerrilla commander who had been Go-Daigo's most effective supporter, remained loyal to the southern court. In 1336, at the Battle of Minatagawa, he faced Ashikaga forces despite being heavily outnumbered. According to legend, he knew the battle was hopeless but fought anyway out of loyalty to his emperor. He and his brother perished in the fighting. Masashige became a symbol of perfect loyalty, celebrated in later periods as the ideal of samurai devotion to duty, despite impossible odds. The Meiji Restoration had lasted only 3 years, but its failure was instructive. It demonstrated that the clock could not be turned back, that warrior government had become too deeply embedded to be simply abolished. It showed that effective rule required acknowledging political realities rather than appealing to ancient precedents. And it proved that personal ambition particularly among powerful warriors, would always complicate attempts at centralized control. Ashikaga Takauji would build a new shogunate on these lessons, but the legitimacy crisis created by the dual courts would haunt his government for decades. The Muromachi shogunate and the flowering of samurai culture. Ashikaga Takauji formally received the title of shogun in 1338, establishing what would become known as the Muromachi shogunate, named after the district of Kyoto, where later Ashikaga shoguns would build their headquarters. Unlike the Kamakura government, which had ruled from the eastern provinces, Takauji and his successors governed from the capital itself. This proximity to the imperial court and aristocratic culture would profoundly shape the character of Ashikaga rule. The new shogunate faced immediate challenges. The southern court at Yoshino continued to claim legitimacy, and significant territories remained loyal to Go-Daigo's successors. The Ashikaga controlled much of the country, but their authority was contested and often required enforcement. Warriors throughout Japan fought for one court or the other, though allegiances shifted frequently based on local circumstances. The civil war would drag on for decades before the southern court finally accepted absorption into the northern line in 1392. Despite these conflicts, the Ashikaga period saw remarkable cultural developments. The shoguns, particularly the third shogun Yoshimitsu and the eighth shogun Yoshimasa, became sophisticated patrons of the arts. They understood that cultural leadership could reinforce political authority, that aesthetic refinement might compensate for military weakness. Under their sponsorship, forms of artistic expression that blended aristocratic elegance with warrior sensibilities reached new heights. Zen Buddhism exercised profound influence on Ashikaga culture. The austere aesthetics of Zen, emphasizing simplicity, asymmetry, and the beauty of imperfection, appealed to warrior sensibilities while offering philosophical depth. Zen monks served as cultural advisors to the shoguns, designing gardens, conducting tea ceremonies, and creating ink paintings that captured spiritual truths in minimal brushstrokes. The relationship between Zen temples and warrior patrons grew so close that many major temples functioned as centers of political as well as religious power. Ink painting flourished under Zen influence. Artists like Yosetsu and his student Shubun pioneered styles that would define East Asian aesthetics for centuries. Using only black ink and subtle gradations of tone, they created landscapes that suggested vast spaces and profound depths. These paintings weren't mere representations of physical scenes, but expressions of spiritual understanding. Warriors who had spent their lives mastering physical violence now pursued mastery of this refined contemplative art form. No theater emerged as the preeminent dramatic art during this period. Kanami and his son Zeami, under Ashikaga Yoshimitsu's patronage, transformed earlier forms of entertainment into a sophisticated theatrical tradition. No performances combined poetry, music, dance, and striking visual elements into unified aesthetic experiences. The slow, deliberate movements and masked performers created an atmosphere of mystery and depth. Warriors attended no performances as both entertainment and spiritual practice, finding in the plays reflections on impermanence, duty, and the nature of existence. The tea ceremony evolved from a simple social custom into a refined ritual practice. Sen no Rikyu, though he lived later, codified principles that had been developing throughout the Muromachi period. The ceremony took place in small, deliberately rustic tea houses where all participants, regardless of rank, shared a moment of equality and aesthetic appreciation. The ritual emphasized mindfulness, respect, and the beauty of simple things. A perfectly prepared bowl of tea, presented in a carefully chosen ceramic vessel, could become an object of profound contemplation. Architecture reflected these aesthetic principles. The Kinkakuji, or Golden Pavilion, built by Yoshimitsu, combined multiple architectural styles in a building that served simultaneously as villa, temple, and political statement. The structure's gold-leafed upper stories seemed to float above their reflection in the surrounding pond, creating an image of impermanent beauty. Later, Yoshimasa would commission the Ginkakuji, or Silver Pavilion, which emphasized more restrained elegance. Garden design became a major art form. Designers created landscapes that appeared natural, but were actually carefully composed to create specific aesthetic and emotional effects. The dry garden at Ryoanji, though created slightly later, exemplified the period's approach. Raked gravel representing water, carefully placed rocks suggesting islands or mountains, achieving maximum effect through minimal means. Warriors could contemplate these gardens, finding in their arranged elements metaphors for order emerging from chaos. Despite this cultural flourishing, the Ashikaga shogunate never achieved the political stability of Kamakura rule. The shogun's authority over provincial warriors remained tenuous. Powerful families governed their territories with considerable independence, acknowledging shogunal overlordship in theory while acting autonomously in practice. The shugo, who were supposed to serve as the shogun's representatives in the provinces, increasingly behaved like independent lords. Economic changes complicated political relationships. Trade with Ming China brought wealth to those who controlled it. Pirates and legitimate merchants blurred together as Japanese ships sailed to China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. New commercial centers emerged, challenging the old rice-based economy. Guilds of craftsmen and merchants gained influence. These economic developments created new sources of power that existed outside traditional feudal structures. Religious institutions maintained considerable military and economic power. Major temples commanded armies of warrior monks who could influence regional politics. Mount Hiei, overlooking Kyoto, housed thousands of monks whose support was essential for any government hoping to control the capital. The shogunate negotiated with these religious powers, like using diplomacy and patronage to maintain their cooperation, but never fully controlled them. The refined culture of the Ashikaga court existed in constant tension with the reality of warrior politics. Shoguns who spent fortunes on art patronage and temple construction struggled to fund military campaigns. Provincial warriors who observed their superiors' cultural pursuits sometimes questioned whether the Ashikaga possessed the martial vigor necessary for effective rule. The contradiction between the warrior ideal of strength and the cultural ideal of refinement would eventually contribute to the shogunate's collapse. By the mid-15th century, the Ashikaga shogunate's weakness had become undeniable. The shogun's authority barely extended beyond the capital region. Provincial strongmen ruled their territories as virtual kingdoms. Succession disputes within the shogunate itself invited interference from ambitious warriors. The stage was set for the greatest crisis in Japanese history since the Mongol invasions. A crisis that would plunge the nation into a century of civil war and transform the samurai class beyond recognition. The descent into chaos, the Onin War, and the Sengoku Jidai. The Onin War began over a question of succession. Ashikaga Yoshimasa, the 8th shogun, had no male heir. In 1464, he named his younger brother Yoshimi as his successor. Then, the following year, Yoshimasa's wife, Hino Tomiko, gave birth to a son, Yoshihisa. Tomiko, a strong-willed woman with political ambitions, pushed for her infant son to be designated heir instead. The shogunal family split over this question, with powerful warrior families taking sides based on their own interests. The succession dispute became entangled with another conflict. The Shiba family, one of the most powerful warrior houses, was itself divided over succession. So was the Harakeyama family. These internal conflicts drew in allies and enemies, creating a complex web of competing interests. By 1467, 2 great coalitions had formed, each backing different candidates in multiple succession disputes. The stage was set for war in the streets of Kyoto itself. Hosokawa Katsumoto led one coalition, known as the Eastern Army. Yamana Sozen commanded the other, called the Western Army. Despite these directional names, both forces were based in Kyoto, and the war would rage throughout the capital. Each coalition comprised tens of thousands of warriors, far more than Kyoto had ever seen concentrated in one place. The potential for destruction was catastrophic. Fighting erupted in May 1467. What began as skirmishes quickly escalated into full-scale urban warfare. Warriors set fire to buildings to deny their enemies shelter. Flames spread rapidly through the wooden structures that dominated the city. Temples that had stood for centuries burned. Imperial palaces were destroyed. The cultural treasures accumulated over hundreds of years went up in smoke. Kyoto, the jewel of Japanese civilization, became a battlefield where no building was safe and no civilian secure. The war dragged on year after year with neither side achieving decisive victory. Warriors dug defensive positions and built fortifications. Armies besieged each other's strong points. Fighting would flare up, consuming another district, then subside into uneasy stalemate. By 1473, both Hosokawa Katsumoto and Yamana Sozen had died, but their successors continued the conflict. The original causes seemed almost forgotten. Warriors fought because they had been fighting, because they didn't know how to stop. In 1477, the war finally ended, not through decisive victory, but through exhaustion. Both sides withdrew their forces from the capital. No clear winner emerged. The succession questions that had sparked the conflict remained unresolved. Kyoto lay in ruins, roughly 90% of the city destroyed. The shogun remained nominally in power, but his authority had become a hollow shell. The Ashikaga shogunate continued to exist in form, but it no longer governed in any meaningful sense. The true significance of the Onin War lay not in its battles, but in what it destroyed. The war shattered the last remnants of centralized authority in Japan. Provincial warriors who had brought their forces to Kyoto returned home with new understandings of power. They had seen the shogun's weakness up close. They had witnessed how major warrior families fought each other without effective intervention from higher authority. They realized that in the new environment, survival and success depended on personal strength, not loyalty to distant superiors. The war also dispersed cultural treasures and artistic knowledge throughout the provinces. Aristocrats and artists who fled the burning capital took their skills to domains far from Kyoto. Tea masters, no performers, and monks found new patrons among provincial lords. This diffusion of culture meant that refinement was no longer the exclusive preserve of the capital. Regional centers developed their own cultural sophistication, reducing Kyoto's monopoly on civilization. Most importantly, the Onin War marked the beginning of the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. For the next century, Japan would be divided among competing warlords, each seeking to expand their territory and increase their power. The old system of appointed governors and recognized authority structures collapsed. In its place emerged a brutal meritocracy where success went to the strong, the clever, and the ruthless. Provincial warriors returned to their domains and looked at their superiors with new eyes. If the great families could fight over succession with no consequences, why should lesser warriors defer to incompetent lords? A phenomenon called geikokujo, the lower overcoming the higher, became common. Capable retainers overthrew weak lords and seized control. Family names that had ruled for generations disappeared, replaced by new dynasties founded by talented generals or cunning administrators. The daimyo emerged as the dominant political actors. These regional lords ruled territories that ranged from single provinces to multiple regions. They maintained armies, collected taxes, administered justice, and conducted foreign relations as if they were independent sovereigns. They acknowledged no authority above their own except what force compelled them to recognize. Japan had fractured into a patchwork of competing states, each jealously guarding its independence. These new lords faced constant challenges. Stronger neighbors sought to conquer their territories. Internal rivals plotted their overthrow. Economic pressures demanded new sources of revenue. The daimyo had to be administrators, generals, diplomats, and economists simultaneously. Those who failed at any of these roles saw their domains conquered or their positions usurped. Only the most capable and adaptable survived. The chaos created opportunities for social mobility unknown in earlier periods. A peasant with military talent might rise to become a general. A merchant with financial acumen might gain influence over a daimyo's administration. The rigid class structure that had defined earlier ages loosened, not because anyone intended reform, but because survival demanded utilizing all available talent regardless of origin. Warfare itself began to change. The individual mounted archer, announcing his name and seeking personal glory, gave way to massed infantry fighting in disciplined formations. Commanders valued tactical innovation over adherence to tradition. The niceties of formal combat yielded to whatever methods brought victory. War became more total, more brutal, and more decisive. Entire domains could be conquered in a single campaign. Families could vanish overnight. The common people suffered enormously during this period. Armies lived off the land, taking what they needed from villages and farms. Battles destroyed fields and homes. Bandits flourished in areas where governmental authority had collapsed, yet ordinary people also adapted. Villages formed self-defense organizations. Peasant leagues occasionally resisted warrior demands. In the cracks between warring domains, communities found ways to survive and even prosper. The Sengoku period would last roughly a century, from the Onin War's end in 1477 until the final unification of Japan around 1600. It was an age of violence, innovation, and transformation. The samurai class that would emerge from this crucible would be harder, more professional, and more ruthlessly effective than their ancestors could have imagined. But they would also have lost something: the certainty of status, the stability of a recognized order, and the luxury of fighting according to gentlemanly conventions. The Sengoku Jidai was survival of the fittest applied to an entire society, and those who survived would reshape Japan completely. The rise of the great daimyo and the revolution in warfare. The Sengoku period produced a new breed of warlord. These daimyo weren't content to govern inherited territories according to tradition. They sought to expand their power, innovate their methods, and establish domains that could survive in an age without mercy. Several figures exemplified this new type of regional strongman, demonstrating through their successes and failures what the age demanded. Hojo Son, despite sharing a name with the Kamakura-era regents, had no connection to that illustrious family. Born Issei Shinkuro, he was a relatively minor warrior who saw opportunity in chaos. After gaining control of Izu province in 1493, he secured Odawara Castle the following year through deception, establishing himself in the Kanto region. From this base, he gradually expanded his territory through a combination of military conquest and skillful administration. When he died in 1519, he had founded a dynasty that would rule the Kanto for 3 generations. His rise demonstrated that in the Sengoku period, success mattered more than lineage. Takeda Shingen controlled the mountainous Kai province, now Yamanashi Prefecture. Born in 1521, he came to power by forcing his own father into retirement, an act that exemplified Gekokujo principles. Shingen proved a brilliant administrator and military strategist. He developed his domain's gold mines to fund his armies. He constructed sophisticated irrigation systems to increase agricultural production. His military innovations, particularly his use of cavalry in coordinated charges, made his forces formidable. He fought his northern neighbor, Uesugi Kenshin, in a series of battles that became legendary for their intensity and the mutual respect between the commanders. Uesugi Kenshin, lord of Echigo province, now Niigata prefecture, rivaled Takeda Shingen in both military skill and administrative competence. A devout Buddhist, Kenshin never married and reportedly lived an ascetic lifestyle despite his power. He fought Shingen 5 times at Kawanakajima, a plain between their territories, with neither side achieving decisive victory. Kenshin's military reputation rested on his aggressive tactics and personal courage. He reportedly led charges himself, a practice most daimyo had abandoned as too dangerous. His early death in 1578 prevented what might have been a successful bid for national supremacy. These and other daimyo transformed warfare through innovation and necessity. The mounted archer, while still respected, no longer dominated battlefields. Infantry armed with spears became the core of Sengoku armies. The yari, a long spear that could reach 15 to 20 feet, allowed foot soldiers to unhorse mounted warriors and maintain defensive formations. Properly trained spearmen fighting in coordinated units could defeat cavalry charges that would have scattered earlier armies. The ashigaru, foot soldiers recruited from the peasantry, emerged as a significant military force. Unlike samurai, who trained from childhood, ashigaru received relatively brief instruction in basic weapons use, but what they lacked in individual skill, they compensated for through numbers and discipline. 100 ashigaru fighting as a unit could overcome a dozen samurai fighting individually. This democratization of warfare reduced the military advantage of the samurai class while increasing the scale of armies dramatically. Castle architecture evolved to meet new military realities. The earlier fortifications, typically wooden structures on hilltops, gave way to massive stone foundations supporting multiple defensive layers. Daimyo employed specialized stonemasons, often recruited from Korea, to construct walls using precisely fitted stones requiring no mortar. These castles incorporated sophisticated defensive features: moats, multiple baileys, mazes of paths designed to confuse attackers, and strategic placement to max defensive advantages from terrain. Osaka Castle, Himeji Castle, and dozens of others rose across Japan during this period. They served as administrative centers, military headquarters, and symbols of daimyo power. The massive investment required to build these structures indicated the wealth daimyo could extract from their domains and their commitment to defending what they held. A well-built castle could withstand sieges lasting months or even years, fundamentally changing the pace and nature of military campaigns. In 1543, Portuguese traders arrived on Tanegashima, an island south of Kyushu. They brought with them arquebuses, early firearms that would revolutionize Japanese warfare. Within months, local smiths had reverse-engineered the weapons and begun producing Japanese versions. Within decades, Japan possessed more firearms than any European country. The arquebus, or Tanegashima as the Japanese called it, provided ranged killing power accessible to troops with minimal training. Firearms initially faced skepticism from traditionalists who valued the bow's faster rate of fire and the skill required to master it. But the arquebus had decisive advantages. An ashigaru could learn to use it effectively in weeks, while mastering the bow required years. The arquebus could penetrate armor that stopped arrows. A volley of gunfire could break a cavalry charge that would have overrun archers. Forward-thinking daimyo quickly integrated firearms into their armies. Oda Nobunaga would later demonstrate the arquebus's devastating potential at the Battle of Nagashino. But even before that famous engagement, daimyo were experimenting with firearm tactics. They developed rotating volley fire systems to maintain continuous shooting despite the weapon's slow reload time. They combined arquebus units with spearmen to protect the gunners from cavalry. They built low walls that provided shooting positions while shielding gunners from return fire. Warfare was becoming more technological, more systematic, and more lethal. Naval warfare also evolved during this period. Daimyo, with coastal territories, maintained fleets for both military and commercial purposes. Pirates and legitimate traders often overlapped, with warrior families sponsoring maritime ventures that combined trade with raiding. Control of sea lanes meant access to goods from China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Naval battles occurred with increasing frequency as daimyo fought for commercial and strategic advantage. Economic administration became crucial for daimyo success. Maintaining large armies of ashigaru, building massive castles, and acquiring firearms required revenues beyond what traditional rice taxation could provide. Successful daimyo developed mines, promoted commerce, and encouraged crafts production. They reduced internal barriers to trade within their domains while taxing commerce at borders. Some issued their own currency or managed sophisticated credit systems. The daimyo had to be as skilled at economic management as military command. The relationship between daimyo and the peasantry grew more complex. Heavier taxation to support constant warfare pressed on agricultural communities. But some daimyo recognized that prosperous peasants paid more taxes than exploited ones. They invested in irrigation, promoted new crops, and protected merchants who brought goods to rural markets. The most successful domains balanced extraction with investment, maximizing revenues, while maintaining the productivity that generated wealth. Religious institutions faced new pressures during the Sengoku period. Some temples maintained traditional privileges and military forces. Others allied with particular daimyo for protection. A few, particularly those associated with the Ikko sect of Buddhism, organized armed resistance to daimyo authority. These Ikko-iki, leagues of believers mixing religious fervor with political resistance, controlled territories and fought major warlords to stand still. The relationship between religious and political authority, already complex, became violently contested. The constant warfare generated tremendous suffering, but also drove innovation. Military necessity prompted technological adoption and tactical experimentation. Economic pressures encouraged administrative reform. Social mobility increased as talent became more important than birth. The Sengoku period was cruel and chaotic, but it was also dynamic in ways earlier eras had not been. Out of this crucible of conflict would emerge leaders capable of reimagining Japan's political structure and ending the century of civil war. The age of the great unifiers was approaching, and when they came, they would wield the military and administrative innovations the Sengoku period had forged. The unifiers, Oda Nobunaga's ruthless ambition, 1568 to 1582. In the spring of 1560, a young warlord named Oda Nobunaga faced impossible odds. Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the most powerful daimyo in all the land, marched toward Owari province with 25,000 warriors. Nobunaga commanded fewer than 3,000. The wise counselors urged retreat. Nobunaga chose attack. On a hot June morning, Nobunaga led his men through narrow valleys toward Okehazama. The Imagawa forces celebrated their easy victories, many removing armor in the afternoon heat. A thunderstorm rolled across the hills. Under cover of rain and chaos, Nobunaga's warriors struck like lightning at the heart of the enemy camp. Yoshimoto fell. His vast army scattered. The boy they called the Fool of Owari had announced himself to the world. This was Nobunaga's genius. While other daimyo clung to tradition, he embraced innovation. He was among the first to deploy firearms in massed formations, understanding that a peasant with a gun could end a samurai with decades of training. He built vast stone fortresses instead of wooden castles. He encouraged trade and commerce in his domains while others maintained rigid feudal systems. Yet his methods shocked even hardened warriors. In 1571, he turned his attention to Mount Hiei, northeast of the old capital. For centuries, the Buddhist monastery of Enryakuji had stood there, home to thousands of warrior monks who had grown powerful and independent. They allied with Nobunaga's enemies. They refused his demands. On a September night, Nobunaga surrounded the sacred mountain with 30,000 troops. What followed became known as one of the most brutal acts of the age. His forces set the temples ablaze. The flames consumed halls that had stood for 800 years. Accounts differ on the scope of the devastation, but the message rang clear across the land. Religious power would not stand against military authority. No sanctuary remained for those who opposed him. Nobunaga moved from triumph to triumph. He entered the capital in 1568, installing a puppet shogun. He destroyed rival clans one by one. The Takeda cavalry, once considered invincible, fell to his gunners at Nagashino in 1575. By 1582, he controlled nearly a third of the nation. Unification seemed within reach. Then came betrayal. On the night of June 21st, Nobunaga rested at Honnoji Temple in the capital with only a handful of guards. His trusted general, Akechi Mitsuhide, had received orders to march west and join another campaign. Instead, Mitsuhide wheeled his 13,000 troops around and surrounded the temple. The reasons remain debated to this day. Some chronicles speak of repeated humiliations. Others suggest political calculations. Perhaps Mitsuhide saw his master's growing power as dangerous. Perhaps he believed he could seize control himself. More than 50 theories exist, and historians continue to uncover new evidence. Nobunaga fought until he understood escape was impossible. Rather than surrender, he performed the final ritual and disappeared into flames. His retainer set fire to the temple so no enemy could claim his head. The body was never recovered. At 49 years old, the man who nearly unified the realm was gone. Mitsuhide's triumph lasted 13 days. Another of Nobunaga's generals, a man born to peasants who rose through sheer ability, heard the news and raced back from the Western Front. This man would finish what Nobunaga started. The unifiers, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, from peasant to supreme ruler, 1582 to 1598. They called him the monkey. Born to a peasant family in Owari province, the boy who would become Toyotomi Hideyoshi possessed no birthright, no noble blood, no inheritance. What he did possess was a mind sharp as any blade and an ability to read the currents of power better than men born to lead armies. He joined Nobunaga's service as a sandal-bearer. Through cleverness and loyalty, he rose to command armies. He became one of Nobunaga's most capable generals, earning trust through results rather than heritage. When news of the Honnoji incident reached him in the west, Hideyoshi moved with characteristic speed. His forces covered 200 kilometers in under 10 days, a march so swift it became legendary. He made peace with the enemy he'd been fighting, the Mori clan, and turned his full attention to Mitsuhide. At the Battle of Yamazaki, barely 2 weeks after Nobunaga's end, Hideyoshi crushed the traitor's army. Mitsuhide perished in the chaos, his brief reign over before it began. Now came the delicate work of securing power. Hideyoshi could not claim the title of shogun. That honor belonged only to those descended from the Minamoto bloodline. Instead, he maneuvered through the imperial court, accepting appointments that gave him authority without the hereditary title. By 1585, he became Kampaku, the imperial regent, and took the name Toyotomi. He moved systematically to bring the remaining independent lords under his control. In 1587, he subdued Kyushu in the south. In 1590, after a siege lasting months, he forced the surrender of the Hojo clan in the east. For the first time in over a century, one man commanded the entire realm. But Hideyoshi understood that military conquest alone could not maintain peace. He implemented reforms that would shape society for centuries. In 1588, he issued the Sword Hunt Decree, the Katanagari. All weapons were to be collected from farmers and townspeople. Only the samurai class could bear arms. The official explanation spoke of using the metal to construct a great statue of Buddha. The true purpose was clear. Armed peasants had formed rebellious leagues throughout the previous decades. Hideyoshi ensured such uprisings could never threaten stability again. The decree established a rigid separation between warriors and farmers, crystallizing class divisions that would define the coming era. Records from just one county in Kaga province reveal the scale of confiscation. From 3,400 households, authorities collected over 1,000 swords, 1,500 short swords, 700 daggers, 160 spears, and 500 suits of armor. Across the realm, the disarmament reshaped society fundamentally. Hideyoshi also conducted comprehensive land surveys, assessing every domain's productive capacity. He reorganized territories, rewarding allies and neutralizing potential threats. The foundations of the peaceful age to come were laid through these administrative reforms as much as through military campaigns. Yet as he aged, Hideyoshi's judgment faltered. In 1592, he launched an invasion of Korea with over 100,000 men intending to conquer the peninsula and then strike at Ming China itself. The campaign became a disaster. Fierce Korean resistance, brilliant naval tactics, and intervention by Chinese forces ground the invasion to a halt. Thousands perished. Millions of yen evaporated. A second invasion in 1597 proved equally futile. The Korean campaigns drained resources and weakened the regime. When Hideyoshi took ill in 1598, he left behind only a 5-year-old heir, Hideyori. Before passing, he called together 5 great daimyo to serve as regents, making them swear repeatedly to protect his son. Their oaths would not last. Among those 5 stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, lord of the eastern domains, wealthiest and most powerful of them all. Patient, calculating, and ruthless when necessary, Ieyasu had waited decades for his moment. Now, with Hideyoshi gone, the final act of unification would begin. The unifiers, Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Seeds of Eternal Peace, 1598 to 1615. For 13 years of his youth, Tokugawa Ieyasu lived as a hostage. The son of a minor lord, he spent his childhood in enemy hands, learning patience and survival. Those lessons shaped the man who would finally end a century and a half of war. After Hideyoshi's death, Ieyasu moved carefully but deliberately. He formed alliances through marriage. He redistributed lands. He approved political arrangements without consulting the other regents. His rivals watched with growing alarm. Ishida Mitsunari, a brilliant administrator loyal to the Toyotomi cause, organized an alliance against him. In the summer of 1600, battle became inevitable. Mitsunari gathered roughly 80,000 warriors under the banner of the Western Army, drawing support from powerful clans including the Mori and Yukita. Ieyasu commanded the Eastern Army, numbering around 75,000, though some forces had not yet arrived. On October 21st, the two armies converged at Sekigahara, a valley in central Honshu. Morning fog delayed the opening moves. When it lifted, Naomasa of the Eastern forces charged first, beginning the engagement without orders. Other commanders followed. For hours, the battle hung in uncertainty. The Western Army held strong positions on the surrounding hills. Mitsunari's forces fought fiercely in the valley. But Ieyasu had made arrangements before the battle began. Several Western commanders had agreed secretly to change sides. The decisive moment came when Kobayakawa Hideaki, positioned on a crucial hill, led his 15,000 men in a charge against his own allies. Whether he had planned this betrayal or hesitated until the battle's outcome seemed clear, his actions shattered the Western Army's formation. Other turncoats followed. Mitsunari's forces collapsed. 6 hours after it began, the battle ended. Sekigahara claimed perhaps 8,000 lives and determined Japan's future for the next 250 years. Mitsunari fled but was captured days later and executed. The Western lords who survived faced punishment. Some lost all their lands. Others received reduced domains far from strategic areas. In 1603, the emperor appointed Ieyasu as shogun. Unlike Hideyoshi, Ieyasu possessed the proper lineage, though historians note his family trees showed convenient connections to the Minamoto line. 2 years later, he resigned the title, passing it to his son Hidetada. The message was clear. This would be a dynasty. Yet one obstacle remained. Young Toyotomi Hideyori still lived in Osaka Castle, the mightiest fortress in the land built by his father to stand unconquerable. Many daimyo maintained loyalty to the Toyotomi name. Hideyori himself had married Ieyasu's granddaughter in an attempt to unite the families. The final confrontation came over a temple bell. Hideyori sponsored the rebuilding of Hokoji Temple in the capital. An inscription on the new bell contained characters that could be read as wishing death to Ieyasu. Whether intentional insult or unfortunate coincidence, it provided the pretext. In the winter of 1614, Ieyasu's forces, numbering over 200,000, surrounded Osaka Castle. The defenders, including tens of thousands of ronin who flocked to the Toyotomi cause, held firm behind massive walls and water-filled moats. The siege dragged through winter with little progress. Finally, Ieyasu negotiated. The terms seemed reasonable. Hideyori would keep the main tower. In exchange, the outer moats would be filled and certain walls dismantled. Hideyori agreed. What seemed a fair compromise proved a trap. Once the fortifications came down, Osaka Castle lost its impregnability. By summer 1615, fighting resumed. Without their defenses, the castle fell within months. On June 8th, as flames consumed the fortress, Hideyori and his mother chose the final path. The Toyotomi line ended. The last major resistance to Tokugawa rule perished in fire and blood. Ieyasu had achieved what Nobunaga and Hideyoshi began. One government controlled all domains. No daimyo could challenge central authority. No great battles would disrupt the land. The age of war ended. The age of peace began. The Tokugawa shogunate engineering a peaceful prison, 17th century. The Tokugawa crafted a system so elegant and effective that it maintained peace for over 250 years. Understanding how requires understanding the Bakuhan system, the intricate balance of central control and regional autonomy that defined the age. At the system's heart stood the shogun in Edo, governing lands producing 4 million koku of rice annually. Around him, the roughly 260 daimyo controlled their own domains, each a self-governing unit responsible for local administration, justice, and taxation. The daimyo maintained their own armies, collected their own revenue, and enforced their own laws. Yet every significant decision required approval from Edo. The daimyo fell into 3 categories, each carefully positioned. The shinpan were Tokugawa relatives placed in strategic locations to form a protective ring. The fudai were hereditary vassals who had served the family before Sekigahara. They held smaller domains, but received the most important government posts. The tozama were outside lords who had submitted only after the great battle. Though often wealthy and powerful, they were kept distant from the capital and excluded from high office. The most ingenious control mechanism was senkin kotai, alternate attendance. Every daimyo had to spend every other year in Edo. When they returned to their domains, their wives and children remained behind as hostages. The system served multiple purposes simultaneously. First, it prevented rebellion. Any lord who raised arms knew his family would perish immediately. Second, it drained finances. A daimyo maintained 2 complete households, one in his domain and one in Edo. The journey between them required huge processions befitting their status. Thousands of retainers accompanied each lord on these annual trips. The expenses consumed resources that might otherwise fund armies. Third, it redistributed wealth. All that spending flowed into Edo, transforming a small fishing village into one of the world's largest cities. By the 18th century, over 1 million people called Edo home, supported by the constant flow of daimyo wealth. The shogunate imposed other restrictions. The laws for military houses prohibited constructing new castles or repairing old ones without permission. Marriage between important families required approval. Any sign of conspiracy brought swift punishment. The shogun could reduce a domain, transfer a daimyo to distant lands, or demand the final ritual for serious transgressions. Society itself was frozen into rigid classes. The Shino Kosho system placed samurai at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants. Movement between classes became nearly impossible. A farmer's child would be a farmer. A merchant's child would be a merchant. The system valued rice production above commercial wealth, though in practice, merchants often grew richer than samurai. The most dramatic policy was sakoku, national isolation. Christianity had spread through the previous century, brought by Portuguese and Spanish missionaries. The shogunate saw foreign religion as a threat to stability. Hideyoshi had begun persecuting Christians. The Tokugawa took it further. By 1639, all Portuguese were expelled. Spanish were already banned. Christianity was outlawed completely. Japanese Christians faced execution if they refused to recant. The most famous incident occurred at Shimabara in 1637, where tens of thousands of Christian converts and ronin rebelled. The shogunate crushed them without mercy. Only the Dutch remained, confined to the tiny island of Dejima in Nagasaki harbor. Chinese traders continued commerce under strict supervision. All Japanese were forbidden to leave the islands. Ships capable of ocean voyages were prohibited. The drawbridge lifted. The doors closed. This isolation served the shogunate's purpose. Foreign trade and foreign ideas might upset the carefully balanced order. Western weapons might give ambitious daimyo new advantages. Christianity offered loyalty to a power beyond the shogun. Better to seal the realm and maintain stability. For generations, the system worked brilliantly. No wars devastated the countryside. No armies marched through rice fields. The population grew. Culture flourished. Yet the very rigidity that brought peace would eventually become a prison from which there seemed no escape. The samurai in peace, bureaucrats, scholars, and ronin. Picture a warrior trained from childhood in sword, spear, and bow, his family bred for battle over centuries. Now imagine telling him there will be no more battles. This was the samurai's paradox in the long peace. For the first few generations, the transition brought relief. The wars had claimed countless lives. Entire families had been erased. Domains had changed hands. Now, at last, stability. But what purpose did a warrior serve in peacetime? The answer came gradually. Samurai became administrators. They ran the domains, collected taxes, supervised public works, adjudicated disputes. The sword remained at their side, symbol of their status, but they wielded the brush more often than the blade. Literacy became as important as martial skill. Many studied Confucian texts, learning the principles of governance and social order. The shogunate encouraged this transformation. Neo-Confucianism offered an ideology perfectly suited to maintaining hierarchy. It taught that society functioned best when everyone accepted their proper role. The ruler ruled. The subject obeyed. Order flowed from top to bottom, like water finding its level. Some samurai embraced scholarship wholeheartedly. They wrote poetry. They studied mathematics and astronomy. They painted and composed music. The stereotype of the warrior poet became reality for many. The rough soldiers of the warring age gave way to refined gentlemen versed in multiple arts. Yet, economic reality created problems. Samurai received stipends measured in rice from their lords. These stipends, calculated during the early Tokugawa period, rarely increased. Meanwhile, everything else became more expensive. Merchants grew wealthy through trade, but samurai, forbidden from commerce by class regulations, watched their purchasing power erode. Many samurai fell into debt. Some married merchants' daughters for the dowry. Others secretly engaged in handicrafts, hiding their economic activities out of shame. Pride and poverty existed side by side. A samurai might lack money for rice but could not work like a commoner without losing face. The ronin faced harder circumstances still. Masterless samurai had always existed, but their numbers swelled during the transition to peace. When daimyo lost their domains or had them reduced, their samurai became unemployed. Some found new lords. Many did not. Without masters, ronin had no stipends, no purpose, no place in the rigid social structure. They drifted through the cities, sometimes tutoring, sometimes working as bodyguards, sometimes turning to crime. The shogunate viewed them with suspicion, fearing they might join rebellions or cause unrest. The most famous Ronin tale became the embodiment of the samurai ideal. In 1701, Lord Asano Naganori drew his sword in Edo Castle and attacked a court official named Kira Yoshinaka. The reasons involved complicated matters of protocol and insult. Drawing a blade within the castle was absolutely forbidden. Asano was ordered to perform the final ritual. His domain was abolished. His samurai became Ronin. For nearly 2 years, 47 of these Ronin planned revenge. They scattered and pretended to pursue other lives. Their leader, Oishi Yoshio, acted like a drunk wastrel, throwing off suspicion. Then, on a snowy December night in 1702, they assembled and attacked Kira's mansion. They took his head and placed it on their master's grave. The act violated the shogunate's prohibition on private revenge, yet it exemplified perfect loyalty. The authorities faced a dilemma. Public opinion strongly supported the Ronin. Their deed demonstrated everything Bushido taught. After much deliberation, the shogunate allowed them to die with honor rather than face execution as common criminals. The 47 performed the final ritual together, becoming instant legends. Their stories spread through plays and popular accounts, celebrated as the ultimate example of samurai virtue. Yet it also revealed the contradiction at the heart of the peaceful age. The qualities that made great warriors, loyalty to the point of death, willingness to sacrifice everything for honor, had no proper outlet in a world without battles. The peace that brought prosperity and stability also left the samurai adrift, searching for purpose in a society that no longer needed them to fight. This tension would simmer for generations, waiting for the moment when the rigid system finally began to crack. The way of the warrior codified, the evolution of Bushido. During the fighting years, samurai followed practical codes focused on effectiveness. Loyalty mattered because disloyalty got you and your family terminated. Courage mattered because cowardice meant defeat. Honor mattered because reputation affected your prospects. These were survival principles refined through constant warfare. The peace changed everything. Without actual battles to test warriors, how did one prove samurai worth? The answer emerged slowly as thinkers tried to define what made a samurai more than just an armed bureaucrat collecting taxes. The word Bushido itself, the way of the warrior, barely appeared in texts before the Tokugawa period. Earlier samurai would have found the concept strange. They had their customs and traditions, certainly, but these were diverse and practical rather than unified and philosophical. The codification began in earnest during the late 17th century. Yamaga Soko, a Confucian scholar and military theorist, argued that samurai must justify their privileged position. Since they produced no rice, crafted no goods, and engaged in no commerce, what value did they provide? Yamaga's answer was moral leadership. The samurai, he taught, should be living exemplars of virtue. Through constant self-cultivation, they would embody the principles of loyalty, righteousness, courage, and honor. Their very existence reminded society of its highest ideals. They were to be models that others could follow. This was revolutionary thinking. It transformed the samurai from a functional military class into a moral elite whose primary duty was ethical perfection. The emphasis shifted from actual fighting ability to spiritual development. The sword became less a weapon and more a symbol of the warrior's soul. Other thinkers contributed different elements. Some emphasized Zen Buddhism's influence, teaching that samurai should approach death with complete equanimity. The famous saying emerged, "The way of the warrior is death." This didn't mean seeking annihilation, but rather living fully in each moment without fear, ready to accept death whenever it came. Neo-Confucianism provided the framework for loyalty and social hierarchy. A samurai's supreme virtue was unwavering service to his lord, even unto death, even beyond death. The relationship between lord and retainer was sacred, transcending all other bonds. The most influential text appeared in the early 18th century. Hagakure, compiled from the sayings of Yamamoto Tsunetomo, presented an uncompromising vision. It insisted that Bushido meant choosing death in every situation. When facing a dilemma, one should choose the path most likely to result in one's demise. This guaranteed acting without calculation or hesitation. Modern scholars note that many of these ideas represented invention rather than preservation. The thinkers of the peaceful age were constructing an idealized past. imagining how warriors should have behaved rather than describing how they actually had behaved. Real samurai of the warring years had been far more pragmatic, frequently switching sides, negotiating surrenders, and generally trying to survive. Yet these invented traditions had real power. They shaped how samurai understood themselves and their role. Young warriors studied these texts, absorbing their teachings. The code became self-reinforcing. Each generation learned these ideals and tried to embody them, creating reality from myth. The emphasis on loyalty created problems when lord and duty conflicted with justice or common sense. The code of honor could justify terrible actions if framed as service. Individual judgment was subordinated to obedience. The system prioritized order over all other values. Still, Bushido at its best taught restraint, compassion, and responsibility. A true samurai should protect the weak, govern justly, and maintain personal integrity. The ideal warrior was also a scholar, artist, and administrator. Crude violence was beneath a refined samurai. Strength should be tempered with wisdom. These philosophical developments mattered because they would outlast the samurai class itself. When the actual warriors disappeared, Bushido remained, adapted and transformed, but still influential. It became part of Japan's cultural DNA, for better and worse, shaping attitudes and behaviors long after the last samurai laid down his sword. The cracks appear: domestic unrest and foreign pressure, 18th to 19th centuries. For a century, the Tokugawa system functioned smoothly. Then the cracks began to show. The rigid structure that brought peace now generated pressures threatening to tear society apart. The economic contradictions grew most obvious first. The samurai class consumed roughly 6% of total income while producing nothing. Their stipends strained domain budgets. Meanwhile, the merchant class, officially lowest in the social hierarchy, accumulated vast wealth through commerce. This inversion of status and economic power created resentment on both sides. Famines struck repeatedly during the 18th century. The Kyoho famine of the 1730s, the Tenmei famine of the 1780s, the Tempo famine of the 1830s. Each time, thousands starved while rice merchants hoarded supplies and government response proved inadequate. Peasant uprisings multiplied. Entire villages stopped paying taxes. Some riots targeted wealthy merchants. In 1837, a remarkable rebellion erupted. Oshio Heihachiro, a former government official and samurai, witnessed terrible suffering during the Tempo famine. He sold his possessions to buy rice for the starving. When that ran out, he led an armed uprising against the authorities in Osaka, calling for direct action against corrupt officials and rice hoarders. The shogunate crushed the rebellion within days, but its symbolic impact resonated. Even loyal samurai were questioning the system. The samurai themselves faced a crisis of purpose. Born and trained as warriors, they worked as bureaucrats. Their stipends bought less each year. Their status commanded less respect as merchant wealth dominated. Many fell into debt. Some abandoned their class obligations entirely, taking up commerce or other prohibited occupations. The foundation of the social order was crumbling. Intellectual ferment accompanied economic pressure. Scholars gained access to Dutch books through Nagasaki, learning about Western science, medicine, and political thought. This Dutch learning opened windows into a wider world. Some thinkers began questioning whether isolation still served the nation's interests. Others developed a fierce nationalism tinged with emperor worship. They argued that the shogunate had usurped power that rightfully belonged to the imperial house. This Sonojoy movement, revere the emperor and expel the barbarians, gained adherents among young samurai who saw restoring imperial rule as the solution to the nation's problems. Then came the ships. Russian vessels appeared in northern waters. British ships prowled the coasts. American whalers needed ports to resupply. The Western powers had forced open other Asian nations through violence. Would Japan be next? In 1853, 4 black-hulled steamships entered Edo Bay, flying American flags. Commodore Matthew Perry carried a letter from the president demanding that Japan open to trade and provide humane treatment to shipwrecked sailors. The ships were armed with modern cannon. The shogunate possessed no defense against such weapons. Perry departed, but promised to return the next year for an answer. The shogunate did something unprecedented. It asked the daimyo for advice. Opinions flooded in, ranging from immediate war to immediate capitulation. The consensus supported negotiation but revealed that even loyal lords no longer viewed the shogunate as invincible. When Perry returned in 1854 with an even larger fleet, the shogunate signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening 2 ports. More treaties followed with other Western powers. These unequal agreements gave foreigners legal privileges, limited Japan's ability to set its own tariffs, and generally treated the nation as an inferior power. The humiliation stung. For over 2 centuries, the Tokugawa had claimed to be barbarian-subduing generalissimos, protectors of the realm. Now they had submitted to foreign demands without resistance. The mystique of shogunal authority evaporated. Young samurai from domains like Choshu and Satsuma grew radical. They attacked foreigners, burned foreign buildings, and assassinated officials who cooperated with the outsiders. When Western ships retaliated with bombardments, destroying forts and demonstrating overwhelming firepower, these same samurai learned a terrible lesson. Hatred of foreigners alone would not preserve independence. Japan must modernize or face conquest. The contradictions became unsustainable. The shogunate tried reforms but lacked resources and faced resistance from conservative elements. The daimyo divided into factions. Some supported the shogun, others secretly allied with the imperial court. Trust dissolved. Violence escalated. The system built to prevent civil war was producing exactly that. By the mid-1860s, open conflict erupted between pro-shogunate and pro-imperial forces. The long peace was ending. A new age approached, bringing with it radical transformation. The samurai who had maintained order for centuries would soon discover that the world had changed too much for their traditional role to survive. The fall of the shogunate, the Meiji Restoration, 1853 to 1868. The final years came swiftly once the momentum turned. What had seemed permanent and unshakable collapsed in less than 2 decades, swept away by forces the system itself had created. The shogunate made a fatal decision in 1858. Under pressure from Western powers, it signed commercial treaties without imperial approval. This broke the fundamental fiction that the shogun governed in the emperor's name. Now the imperial court openly opposed shogunal policy. Activists had the perfect rallying cry: restore the emperor's rightful authority. The imperial court itself resided in Kyoto, living on subsidies from the shogunate, wielding only ceremonial power. But as a symbol, the emperor proved invaluable. The Sono Joy movement, revere the emperor and expel the barbarians, attracted young samurai from powerful domains, especially Choshu and Satsuma in the southwest. These domains had long chafed under Tokugawa control. As Tozama lords, they held wealth and power but were excluded from high office. Their samurai, educated and ambitious, saw in the crisis an opportunity to reshape the nation. They launched a campaign of terrorism, attacking foreigners and pro-shogunate officials. The shogunate responded with force. In 1863, after Choshu fired on Western ships passing through the Straits of Shimonoseki, a combined Western fleet retaliated, destroying the domain's coastal defenses. In 1864, Choshu forces attempted to seize the imperial palace. Shogunal armies marched to punish them. But something unexpected happened. The defeated domains learned from their failures. Instead of retreating into isolation, they began modernizing their forces. They purchased Western weapons. They trained troops in Western tactics. They organized armies based on conscription rather than samurai lineage. When the shogunate moved against Choshu again in 1866, they met surprisingly effective resistance. Meanwhile, the shogunate weakened internally. The young shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, understood that reform was necessary, but faced opposition from conservative elements within his own government. Financial crisis worsened. The samurai stipends consumed too much revenue. The costs of dealing with Western powers and internal unrest drained the treasury. In late 1867, facing impossible circumstances, Yoshinobu made a calculated gamble. He resigned his position and returned political authority to the emperor, hoping to maintain influence in a new government structure. The move shocked everyone. But the anti-Tokugawa faction wasn't satisfied with resignation. On January 3rd, 1868, forces from Satsuma and Choshu staged a coup at the imperial palace in Kyoto. They issued a declaration restoring imperial rule and stripping Yoshinobu of all titles and lands. The 15-year-old Emperor Meiji became the face of the new government. Yoshinobu's supporters felt betrayed. Negotiations had failed. The hardliners had won. Fighting erupted at Toba Fushimi, just south of Kyoto. Despite superior numbers, the shogunal forces faced troops using modern rifles and tactics. The imperial army raised the emperor's standard. Yoshinobu's forces faltered and broke. The Boshin War had begun. For over a year, pro-shogunate forces resisted across the country. The battles generally went badly for them. The imperial armies, though often outnumbered, had better weapons, better training, and the psychological advantage of fighting for the emperor rather than the shogun. The shogunate negotiated the peaceful surrender of Edo Castle, sparing the city from attack. But resistance continued in the north. Aizu Domain, loyal to the Tokugawa to the end, fought stubbornly before surrendering. The final holdouts fled to Hokkaido, attempting to establish an independent republic. That too fell by mid-1869. The Meiji government now faced the immense task of consolidating power. They moved carefully, step by step. First, they abolished the domains entirely, replacing them with prefectures governed by appointed officials. The daimyo became nobles in a new aristocracy, but lost all political power. Then came the samurai's turn. In 1871, the government commuted samurai stipends to bonds, effectively ending the guaranteed income. In 1873, they established universal military conscription. Peasants would now defend the nation, not samurai alone. In 1876, the Haitore Edict prohibited anyone except military and police from wearing swords in public. These reforms dismantled 7 centuries of samurai dominance in the space of less than a decade. The warrior class that had ruled Japan since the Kamakura period lost its defining characteristics. No stipends, no special legal status, no swords. Many adapted, joining the new government bureaucracy or entering business. Others seethed with resentment. The changes happened so quickly that much of society struggled to keep pace. Ancient customs disappeared. Western dress became fashionable. The calendar changed to the Western system. Railways began connecting cities. Telegraph lines spread communication. The slogan was Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment. Everything old seemed destined for replacement by everything new. Yet for all the dramatic change, many of the same people held power. The leaders of the Meiji government were samurai from the southwestern domains. They wore Western clothes and spoke of progress, but they governed with the same hierarchical methods the Tokugawa had used. The system changed. The power structure merely adapted. Still, something fundamental had shifted. The rigid order that sustained itself for generations through careful balance and isolation had given way to rapid modernization and engagement with the wider world. The samurai as a class no longer existed. But the question remained, what would happen to those warriors who could not or would not adapt to the new age? The samurai's last stand, the Satsuma Rebellion, 1877. Saigo Takamori should have been triumphant. He had led forces in the Boshin War. He served as a top advisor to the new Meiji government. His status and reputation were unmatched among the men who had overthrown the shogunate. Yet, by 1877, he stood at the head of a rebel army fighting against the very government he had helped create. The tension had been building for years. Saigo believed in gradual reform that honored samurai traditions. Others in the government pushed for radical modernization. The conflict came to a head over Korea. Saigo advocated sending a mission that might provoke war, seeing foreign conflict as a way to give samurai purpose. His colleagues rejected the plan, fearing it would derail domestic reforms. In 1873, defeated in the debate, Saigo resigned and returned to his home in Satsuma. Thousands of samurai followed him, disappointed with a government that seemed to betray everything they had fought for. In Satsuma, Saigo established private schools teaching traditional military arts alongside modern subjects. Young samurai flocked to them. The government viewed these schools with suspicion. Saigo commanded intense loyalty. His students numbered in the tens of thousands. When authorities attempted to remove weapons from Satsuma arsenals, violence erupted. The students raided the stores, seizing guns and ammunition. Saigo faced an impossible choice. He personally opposed rebellion, but his followers demanded action. If he refused to lead them, they would fight anyway, leaderless and doomed. If he led them, he became a traitor to the government he had served. In the end, loyalty to his students won. On February 15, 1877, roughly 30,000 samurai marched north from Kagoshima. Their initial target was Kumamoto Castle, a formidable fortress garrisoned by imperial troops. Saigo's forces besieged it through February and March, but the castle held. Meanwhile, the government mobilized a massive response. Using the new railway system, they transported troops and supplies rapidly southward. The imperial army now consisted mostly of conscripted peasants wearing Western uniforms and carrying modern rifles. They drilled in European tactics and received regular pay. This was precisely the type of military the traditionalist samurai despised. Farm boys with guns facing warriors descended from centuries of martial tradition, yet the battles told a clear story. At Tabaruzaka, a crucial pass north of Kumamoto, 17 days of fighting in March resulted in government victory. The samurai fought with extraordinary courage, launching suicidal charges against entrenched positions. Their bravery couldn't overcome artillery and repeating rifles wielded by disciplined formations. Saigo's army retreated southward through the spring and summer, fighting a series of defensive battles. Government forces numbered over 60,000 by mid-year. The rebels dwindled through casualties and desertion. By September, fewer than 500 remained, surrounded on Shiroyama, a hill overlooking Kagoshima. The government offered terms. Saigo could surrender and receive lenient treatment given his past service. He refused. On September 24th, the Imperial Army launched its final assault. Artillery pounded the hill through the morning. Then infantry advanced. The surviving samurai met them in close combat. The exact circumstances of Saigo's end remain debated. Some accounts say he received a fatal wound during the fighting. Others suggest he performed the final ritual once defeat became certain. His loyal retainer took his head to prevent capture. At the age of 49, the last great samurai commander perished on a hill in his homeland. The Satsuma Rebellion claimed over 12,000 lives and cost the government enormous sums. Yet it accomplished something important for the new regime. It demonstrated that the modern military could defeat even the finest samurai warriors. The old order had received its final test and failed. No one could claim anymore that traditional warriors remained necessary for national defense. More significantly, it ended the possibility of samurai-led resistance to modernization. After Satsuma, minor uprisings continued occasionally, but nothing on that scale. The warrior class understood that fighting the new order was futile. They could adapt, or they could fade into irrelevance, but they could not reverse history. The government treated Saigo with respect in death. Within decades, he was rehabilitated, pardoned, and celebrated as a tragic hero who exemplified loyalty even in rebellion. Statues were erected, stories spread. He became a symbol of the samurai spirit, admired precisely because he represented values the modern age was leaving behind. The rebellion marked the definitive end of an era. The samurai who survived now had to find their place in a world that no longer needed warriors. Some thrived in business or government. Many struggled with poverty and purposelessness. The class that had defined Japanese society and culture for 7 centuries was disappearing, not through sudden catastrophe, but through gradual absorption into modernity. Legacy of the samurai, from militarism to global icon. The samurai vanished as a legal class in the 1870s, yet their influence expanded and transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The warriors became myths, and those myths shaped reality far beyond their island origins. In the decades after the Meiji Restoration, the new government needed to forge national identity. They looked to the samurai past for inspiration. The warriors became symbols of Japanese spirit and discipline. School textbooks taught their stories. The values associated with Bushido were presented as eternal Japanese characteristics, even though many had been formulated only a century earlier. This romanticization intensified during the militaristic period of the early 20th century. As Japan built its empire, military leaders invoked samurai ideals to justify aggression and demand sacrifice. Bushido became state ideology. Young soldiers were taught they should embrace death like the warriors of old. The kamikaze pilots of World War II were explicitly compared to samurai choosing honor over survival. This appropriation distorted history severely. Real samurai had been pragmatic, often switching sides, frequently avoiding battle when possible. The constructed image emphasized death worship and absolute obedience in ways that served militarist aims more than historical accuracy. The samurai myth became a tool for mobilizing a population toward war. After Japan's defeat in 1945, occupation authorities tried to suppress these militaristic aspects of samurai glorification, yet the fundamental fascination remained. In the post-war period, the samurai were reinterpreted again. Now they represented dedication, loyalty to one's company, and tireless work ethic. The salarymen of Japan's economic miracle were compared to samurai serving their corporate lords. Meanwhile, the samurai found new life in popular culture. Akira Kurosawa's films, particularly Seven Samurai in 1954, presented nuanced portraits of warriors as flawed humans rather than perfect heroes. These films achieved international success, introducing global audiences to samurai stories. Western filmmakers borrowed plots and themes. The Magnificent Seven directly adapted Kurosawa's masterwork to the American West. Literature contributed to the global spread. Novels by authors like James Clavell brought samurai culture to Western readers, though often through romanticized lenses. The market for samurai stories seemed insatiable. Each generation discovered them anew. Martial arts played a crucial role in spreading samurai influence. Kendo, Judo, Aikido, and other Japanese fighting arts found practitioners worldwide. These disciplines claimed connection to samurai traditions, teaching not just physical techniques but also philosophical principles supposedly derived from Bushido. Millions of students learned Japanese terms and absorbed ideas about honor, respect, and self-discipline. In recent decades, the samurai have become fixtures of global popular culture. Video games feature them prominently. Anime and manga explore samurai themes constantly. The katana, the curved sword, has become an instantly recognizable icon even to people who know nothing else about Japanese history. The image of the lone warrior, bound by honor, resonating with audiences across cultural boundaries. Yet, this global popularity raises questions. What are people responding to when they celebrate samurai? Often, it's a heavily filtered version bearing little resemblance to historical reality. The actual samurai were products of a specific time and place, with values that sometimes seem admirable and sometimes deeply troubling to modern sensibilities. They served in a rigid hierarchy that denied most people any agency. They participated in brutal warfare. They enforced class distinctions that oppressed peasants. Their codes justified actions that would be considered atrocities today. Any honest reckoning must acknowledge these aspects alongside the discipline, craftsmanship, and cultural achievements. In modern Japan, the relationship with samurai heritage remains complex. Some see them as sources of national pride and distinctive cultural identity. Others view the samurai obsession as nostalgia for militarism. The debate over how to remember them reflects larger questions about history, memory, and national identity. The business world continues to invoke samurai principles. Books apply Bushido to management theory. Companies emphasize loyalty and dedication using warrior metaphors. Whether this represents genuine cultural continuity or marketing appropriation remains debatable. What seems clear is that the samurai, having disappeared as a physical reality, achieved a second existence as symbols infinitely adaptable to different needs and contexts. They can represent violence or peace, tradition or change, oppression or liberation, depending on who tells the story and why. Perhaps this is their ultimate legacy. The actual warriors lived and perished. The idea of the warrior transcended history, becoming something that exists independent of fact. In this transformation, they joined other legendary figures, knight and cowboy, Viking and gladiator, whose historical reality matters less than their mythological power. The samurai story remains compelling because it speaks to universal human concerns, questions of loyalty and duty, the tension between violence and civilization, the search for meaning beyond mere survival. These themes resonated in medieval Japan and still resonate today. For over 7 centuries, warriors dominated the islands. They shaped culture, politics, warfare, and daily life. When their era ended, they left behind not just ruins and artifacts, but also stories, values, and ideas that continue to evolve and influence. This makes them more than just a historical curiosity. They become a mirror in which different ages see different reflections, each generation finding in the samurai what it needs to find. The warriors are gone, the legend endures, and perhaps that is the most fitting tribute to a class that valued reputation and honor above all else. They sought to build legacies that would outlast their lives. In that, at least, they succeeded beyond any measure they could have imagined.